While America wrestles with record inflation, rising debt, and the threat of a government shutdown, Washington quietly moves between $35 and $45 billion overseas not to rebuild a U.S. city, not to support American farmers, but to rescue Argentina's collapsing economy. No congressional approval, no public debate, no media outrage, just a silent transfer of billions through something most Americans have never even heard of: the Exchange Stabilization Fund. But here's where it gets deeper. This isn't just about Argentina. It's about a financial chess match playing out on the world stage, one meant to counter China's rise and defend the last pillar of American dominance, the power of the dollar. Because the real stakes here are nothing less than the future of global money itself. Let me walk you through something that might sound impossible at first. Picture the US government right now, in the middle of budget battles, with programs being cut and services being suspended, deciding to spend an amount equivalent to what some small countries produce in an entire year on buying the currency of a nation that isn't even among our top 10 trading partners. Not our top 5, not even close. Argentina, a country whose peso has hyperinflated somewhere north of 200%. A currency that, by any reasonable measure, is losing value faster than ice melts in the summer sun. And we're told this is a good investment, that it makes perfect sense, that it's strategic. But when you dig deeper, you start to see contradictions everywhere. The Treasury Secretary goes on record saying this isn't a bailout, that no money is being transferred, that the Exchange Stabilization Fund has never lost money and won't lose money now. And yet, if you hold a currency that's collapsing and that currency keeps collapsing, where does the loss go? Who absorbs it? These are the questions I kept asking myself when I first heard about this deal. Why Argentina? Why now? And, most importantly, who actually benefits when the US government steps in to prop up a foreign economy that, frankly, most Americans couldn't locate on a map without a moment's thought? The more I looked into it, the more I realized this story isn't just about financial policy. It's about power. It's about influence. It's about a quiet war being waged not with missiles or tariffs, but with currency swaps and strategic investments. And at the center of it all is a fund most people have never heard of, created almost a century ago, sitting inside the US Treasury, like a financial emergency toolkit. So, let's pull back the curtain and see where this money really comes from. The Exchange Stabilization Fund, the ESF, was born in the depths of the Great Depression. The year was 1934. President Franklin Roosevelt had just done something extraordinary. He changed the price of gold. Not the market price, mind you, the official government price. He took gold from roughly $20 per ounce and reset it to $35 per ounce. Overnight, the USS government's gold reserves were suddenly worth 70% more than they were the day before. Think about that for a moment. It's as if you woke up one morning and your savings account had grown by 70%. Not because you earned it, not because you invested wisely, but because someone in charge simply declared it so. That's what happened. And the profit from that revaluation, it created billions of dollars in what you might call windfall gains for the Treasury. But instead of letting Congress spend it all, which, let's be honest, they probably would have, Roosevelt locked it away in a special fund, a fund that could be used for emergencies, for stabilizing the dollar, for intervening in currency markets when things got shaky. And the beauty of it, from a government perspective, was that it didn't require congressional approval every time they wanted to use it. Now, this fund has been used before, but only a handful of times in the past 90 years. Back in the mid-92nd, when Mexico's peso was in free fall, losing something like 40% of its value in just a few weeks, the US stepped in with ESF money to prevent a complete financial collapse on our southern border. The fear was that if Mexico went down, the chaos would spill over into the United States. So, we intervened, then, again, in 2008, during the global financial crisis, when credit markets froze and even the Federal Reserve was running out of tools. The SF was tapped to stop certain financial instruments to keep the system from imploding entirely. And once more, during the pandemic, when everything seemed to be falling apart and traditional monetary policy like lowering interest rates had already been pushed to zero. But each of those times, there was a clear and immediate threat to the US economy. Mexico's collapse could have triggered a border crisis and a trade disaster. The 2008 meltdown was happening right here on Wall Street in American banks. The pandemic was shutting down the entire world economy. So, why is the ESF being used now to prop up Argentina? Let's talk about Argentina for a moment. This is a country with enormous potential, huge reserves of natural gas, some of the world's largest deposits of lithium, critical for batteries and electric vehicles, vast stretches of fertile farmland, a highly educated population. By all rights, Argentina should be thriving, but instead, it's been stuck in a cycle of economic chaos for decades. Inflation that makes your head spin. Multiple currency exchange rates, one official, others black market because the government can't keep the peso stable. A long history of defaults, of borrowing money, and then being unable to pay it back. And every few years, a new leader comes in, promising reform, promising change, and the cycle repeats. Enter Javier Milei, Argentina's current president. He ran on a platform of free markets, no bailouts from the state, cut the bloat, take a chainsaw to unnecessary government spending. He literally campaigned with that image, taking a chainsaw to the bureaucracy, and his message resonated. People were tired of the same old promises. But here's the irony that's hard to ignore. The man who ran on no bailouts is now receiving one of the largest bailouts in modern history. Now, the official story from Washington is that this is about helping a friend in need. Argentina is struggling. They share our values, or at least the current president does. He's been called MAGA, all the way by President Trump himself, during a visit to the White House. The idea is that, we're helping them stabilize their economy, and in doing so, we're strengthening a strategic partner in a region where we need more allies. It sounds noble, doesn't it? Almost charitable. But when you start connecting the dots, you realize there's another story beneath the surface. A story about global influence, about competition, and about a rising power that's been quietly expanding its reach across the developing world while America was distracted. That power is China. Over the past couple of decades, China has been doing something remarkable and, frankly, a bit alarming if you're sitting in Washington. They've been lending money, enormous sums of it, to countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Not through the traditional institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, but directly through Chinese state banks. They've built roads, railways, power plants, ports, entire infrastructure networks, and they've been doing it with a very specific strategy in mind. Expand influence, secure resources, and slowly, quietly shift the global financial system away from the dollar and toward the yuan. China's currency, backed increasingly by gold. Argentina has been one of those countries. Over the past several years, Chinese banks have lent Argentina billions to build energy projects, to fund nuclear plants, to develop infrastructure, and with each loan, with each project, Argentina becomes a little more dependent on Beijing, a little more aligned with China's vision for the future. So, when the US steps in with this currency stabilization deal, it's not just about helping Argentina, it's about blocking China's expansion. It's about sending a message. If you're struggling, you don't need to turn to Beijing. Washington can still help. The dollar is still powerful. America is still the financial superpower. But here's where the story takes another turn. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because when you look closely at who's actually invested in Argentina's recovery, you start seeing some very familiar names. Hedge funds, Wall Street firms, big investors who've been betting on Argentina's bonds for years. And not just any bonds, distressed debt, bonds that were trading at 25 to 35 cents on the dollar, bonds that the market had essentially written off as losses. Why would anyone buy those bonds? Because if Argentina somehow turned things around, if the peso stabilized, if the government managed to pay back its debts, those bonds could be worth their full face value again. A 5-cent investment becomes a $1 payout. That's a 3 to 100 to 400% return, the kind of return that makes billionaires even richer. But Argentina wasn't turning around. Inflation kept climbing, the peso kept collapsing, and those bonds kept falling. By early 2025, it was looking like a very bad bet. And then right on cue, the U.S. Treasury steps in. Now, I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying anything illegal happened, but I do think it's worth noting some interesting connections. The current U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is one of the most respected macro investors on Wall Street. Before joining the government, he spent years managing billions of dollars for one of the most successful investors in modern history, George Soros. He ran money at Soros's Quantum Fund, worked alongside some of the sharpest financial minds in the world, and made his reputation betting on global macro trends, currency moves, sovereign debt, Exactly the kind of trades we're talking about here. And some of the biggest holders of Argentina's distressed debt, funds like Discovery Capital, which was founded by a former Soros fund manager. Soros Fund Management itself has had exposure to Latin American markets for decades. These aren't random hedge funds making wild bets. These are sophisticated investors with deep connections to the people now running U.S. economic policy. So here's the uncomfortable question. If the U.S. government uses taxpayer-backed funds to stabilize Argentina's currency, who's really being rescued? Is it the Argentine people who are suffering under hyperinflation? Maybe in part. Is it U.S. strategic interests keeping China out of Latin America? Sure, that's part of the calculation too. But is it also Wall Street? Is it also the hedge funds and private investors who made big bets on Argentina's recovery, bets that were failing, and who now get a government-backed safety net to make sure those bets don't collapse entirely? Let me explain how this actually works, because the mechanics matter. The Treasury isn't just writing a check and sending it to Argentina. What they're doing is something called a currency swap. The U.S. Treasury buys Argentine pesos from Argentina's central bank, and in exchange, Argentina gets U.S. dollars. Those pesos are supposed to act as collateral, something the U.S. holds onto as security. But here's the problem. If the peso keeps losing value, and it has been, then the collateral is worth less and less. It's like holding on to a melting ice cube. You're told it's an asset, but every day it's worth a little bit less than the day before. Now, the first portion of this deal, somewhere between $15 and $25 billion, comes directly from the ESF, taxpayer-backed money, managed by the Treasury with no need for Congress to vote on it. The second portion, another $15 to $25 billion, is expected to come from private investors, banks, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds. But here's the catch. They're only willing to chip in because the U.S. government is guaranteeing the security of their money. In other words, if things go wrong, if Argentina defaults again, it's not the private investors who take the hit. It's the U.S. Treasury. And by extension, it's us, the taxpayers. So, are taxpayers paying for this? The official answer is no, not initially. But if it turns out to be a bad investment, if those pesos keep collapsing and Argentina can't pay back what it owes, then yes, absolutely. The shortfall gets absorbed by the Treasury, which means it gets added to the national debt, which means future taxpayers, your grandchildren, maybe end up footing the bill. And, meanwhile, the hedge funds and investors who made those risky bets, they walk away protected. Their downside is covered. Their potential losses are socialized, while their potential gains remain private. It's a pattern we've seen before, haven't we? Too big to fail. Privatize the profits, socialize the losses. And this time, it's not even happening within our own borders. It's happening thousands of miles away in a country that isn't even a major trading partner. But the consequences of this deal are felt much closer to home than you might think. Let me give you an example. American cattle ranchers, farmers who've been raising beef for generations, are now facing a new kind of competition. As part of the broader strategy to support Argentina's economy, there's been talk of importing more Argentine beef into the United States. The idea is that it'll help bring down meat prices for consumers. Sounds good, right? Lower prices at the grocery store, except when you're a rancher in Texas, or Montana or Wyoming, struggling with drought conditions, rising feed costs, and tight profit margins. The last thing you need is subsidized foreign competition flooding your market, because that's essentially what's happening. We're using taxpayer money to stabilize Argentina's economy, which helps that beef industry, and then we're importing that beef, which undercuts American producers. So, in a very real sense, American farmers and ranchers are being asked to compete against their own tax dollars. They're being undercut by a bailout they helped fund. And when they raise concerns about this, they're told it's necessary, that it's strategic, that it's about the bigger picture. But who is bigger picture? Not theirs. This is where the moral contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. We're told that American farmers need to be more competitive, more efficient, more innovative, and they are. American agriculture is among the most productive in the world. But how are you supposed to compete when your own government is subsidizing your competitor? When billions of dollars are flowing to support a foreign industry that directly competes with yours? It's not just beef either. Argentina is one of the world's largest exporters of soybeans, wheat, corn. American grain farmers face the same dynamic. They're being told to cut costs, to work harder, to adapt to changing markets, while their government quietly props up one of their biggest rivals. And the justification that this is about defending the dollar, about blocking China, about securing American interests on the global stage. But if American interests include American farmers, American ranchers, American workers, then who's really being defended here? I think this raises a question that goes beyond agriculture, beyond Argentina, beyond any single deal. It's a question about power, about who shapes policy, about whether our government is working for the people it represents, or for the financial interests that have the connections and influence to protect their investments. Because when you step back and look at the full picture, what you see is a system where financial power and political power have become almost indistinguishable, where a former hedge fund manager becomes Treasury Secretary and immediately starts using obscure mechanisms to deploy tens of billions of dollars in ways that perhaps coincidentally happen to benefit the exact kinds of trades and positions that people in his former world specialize in. Now, I don't think this is a conspiracy. I don't think there's some shadowy group in a smoke-filled room planning all this out. But I do think there's a revolving door, a set of relationships, a worldview shared by people who move between Wall Street and Washington, who see global finance as a chessboard, and who genuinely believe that what's good for the financial system is good for America. And maybe in some ways they're right. Maybe there are times when stabilizing markets, preventing collapse, and defending the dollar's role in the world genuinely does serve the national interest. But maybe we should also be asking at what cost and who pays it. Because the reality is that the United States is not operating from a position of limitless resources. We're running deficits that stretch into the trillions, not billions, trillions. Every year, we borrow more money just to keep the government functioning. We're told that Social Security might not be sustainable, that Medicare needs reform, that infrastructure is crumbling, and we can't afford to fix it. And yet somehow we've got somewhere between 35 and 45 billion lying around to gamble on another country's hyperinflated currency. How does that math work? The answer, of course, is that it doesn't come from some surplus. It comes from the same place all government spending ultimately comes from when we're running deficits. It comes from borrowing, from debt, from promises to pay back later what we're spending now. And if this Argentina bet goes bad, if the peso keeps collapsing, if Argentina defaults again, if those billions evaporate, then that loss doesn't just disappear, it gets added to the national debt. It becomes part of the burden that future generations inherit. But let's zoom out even further, because this story isn't just about one deal with one country. This is about a much bigger shift happening in the global economy. A shift that most people aren't paying attention to, but that could reshape how money works for the rest of our lives. For decades, really since the end of World War II, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency. That means when countries trade with each other, they usually do it in dollars. When central banks hold reserves, they hold dollars. When you want to buy oil, you pay in dollars. This system has given the United States enormous power. It's allowed us to borrow cheaply, to run deficits that other countries couldn't dream of, to impose sanctions and control financial flows in ways that no other nation can. But that system is under strain. China has been building an alternative, slowly, methodically over the past couple of decades. They've been lending money to dozens of countries, not in dollars, but in yuan. They've been building infrastructure, securing resources, and creating dependencies, and increasingly, they've been backing their currency with something tangible, gold. You might have heard about this if you follow financial news. China's been accumulating gold at a pace that's hard to ignore. They're building vaults across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, a network of secure storage facilities where gold can be held, traded, and used as the foundation for a new kind of financial system. Some people are calling it the Golden Corridor. The idea is simple but profound. Instead of a currency backed by debt, by promises, by the full faith and credit of a government, you have a currency backed by something real, something you can hold, something that's been valued for thousands of years now. You might be thinking, didn't we used to have that? Didn't the dollar used to be backed by gold? Yes, until 1971, when President Nixon ended the gold standard. Since then, the dollar has been what's called a fiat currency. It has value because the government says it does, and because people trust that it does. And for 50 years, that's worked. The dollar has remained dominant, but trust is a fragile thing. And when you're running multi-trillion-dollar deficits, When you're printing money to cover shortfalls, when you're using emergency funds to bail out foreign countries, trust starts to erode. So, here's what's really happening with this Argentina deal and why it matters so much. The United States is fighting a financial war, not with tanks or troops, but with currency swaps and strategic investments. We're trying to prevent countries from falling into China's orbit. We're trying to prove that the dollar still has the power to stabilize economies, to provide security, to be the safe haven that everyone turns to in a crisis. Argentina is the test case. If this works, if the peso stabilizes, if Argentina's economy recovers, if they stay aligned with the United States and reject closer ties with China, then Washington can point to this as a success. They can go to other countries and say, see, the US still has your back. You don't need China's loans. You don't need their Belt and Road Initiative. We can provide what you need. And there are already whispers that other countries might be next. Brazil, which owes tens of billions to Chinese state banks. Colombia, whose currency has fallen more than 20% in the past year. Egypt, one of China's biggest borrowers in Africa. Kenya. These are all countries struggling with debt, with inflation, with economic instability. And they're all countries where China has been expanding its influence. But here's the gamble. This strategy depends on success. If Argentina fails, if the peso collapses despite our support, if Emily doesn't get reelected, if the entire thing becomes a financial disaster, then the message is very different. It becomes a signal that the USS is overstretched, that we can't actually stabilize economies anymore, that our promises are empty. And in that case, other countries might decide that China's offer looks more attractive after all. Not because they love Beijing, but because they need someone who can deliver, someone whose currency is backed by real assets, not just debt and promises. That's what makes this such a high-stakes bet. It's not just about Argentina. It's about credibility. It's about whether the dollar remains the world's reserve currency or whether we're watching the beginning of a slow transition to something else. Now, President Trump has made it clear where he stands. During Malay's visit to the White House, he praised him extensively, called him a friend, said his philosophy was correct, but he also made the support conditional. He said if Milei wins re-election, the US will stay with him, but if he doesn't win, we're gone. That's a very interesting political calculation. It ties his financial support to a foreign election outcome. It makes this entire deal contingent on one person, one election, one moment in time. And it raises some uncomfortable questions about what happens if things don't go according to plan. Because elections are unpredictable, voters can change their minds, economic conditions can shift, what looks like a sure thing in one moment can unravel in the next. And if Milei doesn't win, if Argentina goes in a different direction, if they decide that closer ties with China make more sense for their national interests, then what do we just walk away? Do those tens of billions of dollars evaporate? Does the Treasury just absorb the loss and move on? There's a historical parallel here that's worth noting. Back in 1995, when the US bailed out Mexico, it was seen as a bold move, a necessary intervention to prevent chaos on our southern border, and ultimately, Mexico did recover. The peso stabilized. The loan was repaid. The ESF actually made a profit on that deal. But the world was different then. The dollar's dominance was unquestioned. There was no China building alternative financial systems. There was no talk of de-dollarization. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were the only games in town if you needed a bailout. Now, in 2025, the landscape has changed. Countries have options. They can play the US and China against each other. They can take money from both sides. And the consequences of failure are much higher because every failed US intervention is a data point that other countries notice. A signal that maybe the old superpower isn't so powerful anymore. So, what does this mean for ordinary Americans? For people who aren't hedge fund managers, or treasury officials, or geopolitical strategists, it means several things, and none of them are particularly comforting. First, it means more debt. Whether this Argentina deal succeeds or fails, it's adding to the liabilities that the US government carries, and debt has consequences. It means higher interest payments. It means less money available for domestic priorities. It means inflation pressure as the government prints money to cover shortfalls. Second, it means moral hazard. That's an economic term, but it's a simple concept. When you bail people out, when you protect them from the consequences of their bad decisions, you encourage more bad decisions. If hedge funds know that the US government will step in to protect their risky bets on foreign debt, what incentive do they have to be cautious? Why not make even bigger, even riskier bets, knowing that if things go wrong, there's a safety net? And third, it raises fundamental questions about fairness, about whether we're still a country where everyone plays by the same rules, or whether we've created a system where a certain class of people, people with the right connections, the right education, the right access to power, get to operate under a different set of rules than everyone else. Because here's what strikes me as the deepest irony in this whole story. If we're using taxpayer money to rescue investments that regular taxpayers could never make, we're backstopping billion-dollar bond positions that require sophisticated knowledge, international connections, and enormous capital, and we're doing it in the name of defending America's interests. But who's America? The America of small business owners and farmers and retirees trying to make their savings last? Or the America of Wall Street firms and hedge funds, and people who move seamlessly between private wealth and public office? I think that's a question worth sitting with for a moment. And it connects to something even bigger, something about identity, about what America stands for. Because, for most of our history, we've told ourselves a story about being different, about being a country where hard work is rewarded, where fairness matters, where the government represents the people, not just the powerful. But stories only hold true if they're backed up by reality. And when the reality is that tens of billions of dollars can move without congressional approval, without public debate in ways that benefit a very small group of people while putting everyone else at risk, then maybe it's time to ask whether that story still fits. This isn't just about economics. It's about trust. It's about whether our institutions serve the many or the few. And it's about whether we still have the courage to demand answers when things don't add up. In the end, this Argentina deal is both smaller and larger than it appears. It's smaller because in the grand scheme of US government finances, 35 to 4 billion is not an impossible sum. We spend more than that on plenty of things. It's not going to bankrupt us overnight, but it's larger because of what it represents: a willingness to use public resources to protect private interests, a blurring of lines between strategic policy and financial favoritism, a bet that the US can still control the global financial system through sheer force of will, even as the foundations of that system crack and shift beneath us. And perhaps most importantly, it's a test of whether the dollar can still command loyalty, whether American power can still shape outcomes, whether the world we built in the second half of the 20th century can survive into the second half of the 21st. China is watching, other countries are watching, investors are watching, and they're all asking the same question. Is the United States still the indispensable nation, the guarantor of stability, the safe bet in a chaotic world? Or are we just another empire in decline trying to hold on to power through deals that make less and less sense the closer you look at them? I don't have all the answers. I don't think anyone does. But I do think this story, this $40 billion bet on Argentina, is a window into something much bigger. A transition happening in real time, a shift in how global power works, how money flows, and who gets to decide. And maybe this isn't just about economics after all. Maybe it's about whether the system we've built, the one that rewards debt, speculation, and hidden deals, can still serve the people it was meant to protect. Maybe it's about whether we still believe in fairness, in transparency, in accountability, or whether we've decided that those values are luxuries we can't afford in the race to stay ahead. Because in the end, the question isn't just whether the US can outmaneuver China and Argentina. The question is whether we can do it in a way that's consistent with who we say we are, and whether the cost of winning this particular battle is worth what we lose in the process. So if you found the story eye-opening, hit that like button. It really helps this channel reach more curious minds like you. Subscribe for more deep dives into how the world actually works behind the headlines. And drop a comment below. Do you think this $40 billion bet will pay off or backfire spectacularly? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for spending this time with me.